And joining us now, Liam Kennedy. He is Professor of Economic and Social History at Queen's University in Belfast, and he joins us on the line from Belfast, Northern Ireland. And Professor Kennedy, as we get set to talk about what's going on in Ireland these days, I'd like to start our conversation by quoting to you something that Dan O'Brien, the economics editor of the Irish Times, wrote at the end of last month when the European Union and the International Monetary Fund arrived in Ireland for their very propitious negotiations. Nothing quite symbolized this state's loss of sovereignty than the press conference at which the European Central Bank man spoke, along with two IMF men and a European Commission official. It was held in the Government Press Centre beneath the Taoiseach office. I am a xenophile and cosmopolitan by nature, but to see foreign technocrats take over the very heart of the apparatus of this state to tell the media how the state will be run into the foreseeable future caused a sickening feeling in the pit of my stomach. I guess we want to start by just getting some deeper understanding on this side of the pond as to why that would be especially sickening for an Irishman to see that scene.
Well, it was certainly a dramatic, indeed melodramatic moment. There's no doubt we have lost economic sovereignty for the next 4, possibly longer number of years. And I think to get a sense of the depth of feeling in Ireland, the depth of anger in a way regarding this, one has to take the long view. A somewhat simplified view of Irish history is that we've had a long struggle between Ireland and England over several centuries to achieve some degree of autonomy. So the idea of, as it were, throwing away that sovereignty almost carelessly, is really galling for most Irish people.
Let me follow up with this expression that you helped coin, mope. The idea that the Irish are the MOPE, most oppressed people ever. How does this reaction fit into that narrative?
Well, I think there has been a tendency for us as an ethnic group, if you like, to regard Irish history as, particularly oppressive, that we are amongst the most persecuted people on the earth, comparable to the Jews, perhaps. My view, for what it's worth, is that this was to a considerable extent a self-deluding belief, one of, I'm afraid, a number of self-delusions we've entertained down the decades. However, in the current crisis, it is rather different, because actually we are blaming ourselves, and that's quite a change. Usually the traditional enemy, the historic enemy, was the English, the British, but on this occasion we certainly can't blame the English or the British, and indeed they're being quite friendly towards us in terms of providing some of the, voluntarily to some degree, some of the loans that we need. And it's a bit more difficult to blame Brussels, the Europeans, the French and the Germans, because we don't have the historical precedents for that. Though there is some anger, I should say, towards the European Union at present. But primarily, the anger is directed inwards. It's directed towards the political elite, the banking elite, the business elite, particularly builders and property developers. And there is, this is rather more difficult to pin down, but there is some element of self-loathing in all of this as well. Because, we've gone from, a degree of hubris, from being the gleaming, the progressive economy of the Western world to, in 2 short years, to being the basket case, economically speaking anyhow, of the Western world.
Well, let me follow up with this from Fintan O'Toole, who wrote this in the Irish Times. A simple rule of thumb for a sovereign state is that it and it alone makes its own decisions about taxation and spending. For the foreseeable future, Irish governments will not pass this test. Ireland is being placed under adult supervision, and that cuts right through to the most tender nerve of a former colony. What colonial overlords tell their subject peoples is, you're not fit to govern yourselves. This taunt is deeply embedded in our historical consciousness. Much of the Irish history has been shaped by the attempt to disprove it. How has modern Irish history tried to disprove the idea that the Irish can't govern themselves?
Well, the drive for political independence was the foremost expression of that, political and economic independence. And indeed, we achieved that in the early 20th century. I mean, we were one of the newly emerging independent states after the First World War, and we took great pride, perhaps inordinate pride, in that. And to have that whipped away, but not whipped away by external forces, but to a very large extent due to our own miscalculations, our own bad policies, a degree of corruption, degree of gambling, huge degree of gambling. I mean, that is an appalling position to be in. And now, in a sense, as Fintan O'Toole has rightly pointed out, we're placed in an almost infantile status vis-a-vis other European states. And that's not a place one would like to be. But it really is the case that as far as economic affairs are concerned, which is fundamental to so much of society, we're on autopilot for the next 4 years.
But countries give up a bit of sovereignty all the time. Canada, for example, when it joined the North American Free Trade Agreement, gave up a measure of sovereignty in order to be part of that. Ireland gave up some degree of sovereignty back in 1973 when it joined the European Union. Why is this different and more dramatic in your view?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, pooling sovereignty is a key feature of international affairs and the experiences of all kinds of nation states. And indeed, through pooling sovereignty, we sometimes, frequently, if it's voluntary, we enhance our power to make things happen on a different level, actually, enhance our sovereignty. So when we joined the European Union on the 1st of January 1973, there were very substantial benefits for Ireland. When we embraced the euro, we were pooling sovereignty again. What's different about this crisis is that it's not voluntary. I mean, the Irish government, a week before the troubleshooters from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the European Central Bank turned up in Dublin. I mean, it was almost farce at times, the Irish government denying that these people were en route to Dublin. Other reports saying that they were indeed, and hey presto, they turn up in Merrion Square opposite the Irish Department of Finance. Again, of great symbolic significance. But it's not something we have voluntarily entered into, and ideally we would not want to be accepting a loan burden of up to 85 billion, not million, 85 billion euro, about 135 billion Canadian dollars. And, there's the rub. We have to repay these loans.
Well, how much of the anger is over the loss of sovereignty in Ireland, and how much of it is over the notion that really the rescue package, the financial bailout package, is designed to make sure that Germany and England get their money back?
Yes, I'm afraid there is self-interest on the part of Brussels acting on behalf of some of the investors who have loaned somewhat recklessly to the Irish banks, who in turn then loaned literally hundreds of billions of dollars to property developers and other what have turned out to be, to a considerable degree, white elephant projects. So yeah, there is very definitely self-interest on the part of Brussels, and that's part of the anger in Ireland. Interestingly, though, the main anger is directed towards the key players within Ireland. Now, that may change over time, and a more xenophobic, a more Eurosceptic sentiment may emerge in 2011, particularly when the budget cuts begin to bite deeply. It is arguable that we got a bad deal. The interest rate at just under 6% per annum, 5.7%. That's very high by European standards, about 3% above the rate which the German government is paying for its loans. It is conceivable, as in the Icelandic case, that you have a popular revolt, as it were. I don't see it at the moment, but we can't rule that out, in which case we would be facing into a scenario in which there would be a sovereign debt default by the Irish Republic, by the representatives of the Irish people.
And what would that mean?
Well, it gets incredibly complicated at that stage. Incidentally, how this might come about is we will have a general election within the next few months. The governing party, the Fianna Fáil party, will be thrown out of office. It will be something of a meltdown, not wholly unlike what happened to Kim Campbell and the Tories in Canadian politics of the 1990s. I don't think it'll be on that scale, but there is no doubt the present government is so unpopular, with only 14% of the popular vote, according to recent opinion polls. It will be thrown out of office. Who benefits? That's the tricky one. The Irish Labour Party is poised to become a major player. The other major opposition party, Fine Gael, a fairly conservative party, the likelihood is Labour and Fine Gael will form the new government. I think that's the most likely scenario. And that government will attempt to renegotiate the deal with Brussels and the IMF. And it may be able to, make some changes at the edges, but I don't see a radical revision of the agreement coming through. However, if 1-2 years down the line, the current debt burden proves simply unbearable to the Irish taxpayer, and that's a real possibility, then we could lurch, if you like, in a much more radical direction. I mean, current opinion polls suggest that the ultra-nationalist party, Sinn Féin, which was linked to the IRA until fairly recently, is surging ahead in the polls, that 1 in 4 of young people aged 18 to 21 support Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin is Eurosceptic, somewhat xenophobic, ultra-nationalist, and it might take, and it could well be a good populist line, might take the position that we've got to square up to Brussels. It'd be much nicer if it was Britain or the English, because there are all kinds of historical precedents, but they're not in the frame. It's a bit harder to square up to Brussels because we don't have the historical precedents. But, emergency times produce emergency responses. So it is possible we could have, I don't think at the next election, but possibly 2 years from now, an earthquake in Irish politics, in which literally the political landscape is rewritten.
I'm literally down to my last minute here before I lose my satellite time, so let me ask you one last thing. What do you make of the argument that the Irish are being somehow punished for overreaching and that this is perhaps a necessary correction?
Well, I don't think anybody is setting out deliberately to punish anybody else, but I do think that Brussels is looking after the interests of particularly French and German bankers and depositors in the Irish banks. However, there may be a silver lining. I mean, clearly our political institutions need a radical overhaul. It is possible that this is, if you like, the shock to the national psyche, which will set Ireland, this is the optimistic scenario, will set us on a more progressive trajectory, and that even though there's no doubt we will suffer severe pain, financial pain, social pain over the next few years, this may be a turning point in modern Irish history.
Liam Kennedy, it's awfully good of you to join us on the line from Belfast, Northern Ireland. Thanks so much tonight.
Thank you.